Alright everyone, hello, welcome back to Dan's Astrology. Today is September the 21st. I haven't made a video in a little while. I've been taking a bit of a break. As you understand, with all the elections and crazy things with the politics and war and all that, it's a little bit stressful these days. And, sometimes I feel the need to pace myself out a little bit rather than just making videos every day, especially if I'm approaching that material. But on my mind today is more of things to do in my personal life that I'm dealing with as a basis for jumping off into this conversation. The topic today is going to be about Venus, which is currently in a square to Pluto. Venus at the late degrees of Libra, squaring Pluto in the late degrees of Capricorn. And in just a couple days, Venus is going to make its ingress into Scorpio. And then from there, we have basically the bases are loaded in the water signs. We're going to eventually get a grand water trine because we'll have Venus in Scorpio, Mars in Cancer, Saturn and Neptune in Pisces, making for a whole lot of water energy. And that's what's on my mind for this. And also keep in mind that we have just recently had the lunar eclipse in Pisces, a water sign, and the next eclipse is going to be a solar eclipse in Libra, which is an air sign that Venus is the ruler of. So Venus in Scorpio is going to rule over the solar eclipse in Libra, right? And of course, with Libra being related to the scales, being related to justice, there's all this stuff to do with what's fair, what's in balance, what's in harmony, and all this kind of stuff. But Venus, the ruler, will be in Scorpio, giving a bit of a different perspective on the situation than if Venus was in a different sign, right? Scorpio is a place where Venus is said to have poor dignity, because we'll be getting into this anyways, right? That it's something that is a bit antithetical to what Venus is comfortable with. Now, there's something about Venus standing for things like aesthetics, for what's beautiful, for what's harmonious, and all this kind of stuff. And then there's different... there is a certain thing associated with Scorpio that has to do with, seasonally at least, here I'm in the northern hemisphere, and in, it's also, I sometimes forget that Halloween is a properly kind of American, or at least North American thing, that they don't celebrate Halloween quite the same way in other countries. And then it's also interesting too, because at least in the neighborhood that I'm in, I don't know if it's like changing attitudes or, just, especially since post-COVID, when I was a little kid, we used to trick-or-treat a lot, right? You don't get as many trick-or-treaters anymore, especially after COVID. And I don't know if that's like the declining population of children, or if that has to do with, it's also kind of ironic that Halloween has to do with what's fearful and scary and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, right now in our society, it's like, is it because people are too afraid of their neighbors? People are too afraid of their communities to, like, protective to actually indulge in the holiday that's all about ghosts and monsters and scary things, right? Like, we've kind of like it's kind of like in the way that like we can't do satire anymore because like the people are just acting out the jokes themselves. We can't dress up in a costume because we're now too afraid of real life to turn that into a holiday that we celebrate or whatever, or that we play around with, right? We've lost this kind of distance from it, and now we can't watch a horror movie if your own life is a horror movie. You know what I'm saying? Hopefully it doesn't get that bad with this transit, but that's some of the things that are on my mind going into it, right? So one of the things that is on my mind about all this is I'm selecting there's a bunch of stuff going on in my life, but I'm selecting a very specific thing that's on my mind, which happens a lot around this time of year, which is basically dealing with bylaw officers. And I have to admit, I have made this decision basically that I'm not going to use my own astrology channel to complain about my family situation, because there are I oftentimes I help my family out by keeping the bylaw officers at bay, right? A good example of this is that we have blackberry bushes in our backyard, and that it requires a good deal of man labor to keep these blackberry bushes under control, lest they completely spill out over the neighbor's fence into the neighbor's yard, and it's a lot of work, basically, right? But what's interesting is that the neighbors who are most affected by the blackberry bushes don't tend to actually complain about maybe because they see me in there putting in the work to do the blackberries, that they don't tend to complain about the blackberries that much. But it's like, instead, one of the things we're getting complaints about is that we have transformed our front yard into a permaculture garden, and that it's comparatively not that much work to like keep your grass trimmed really short at the front, in the front of your lawn. And comparatively, it takes hours and hours and hours to do all these blackberries, right? So people don't really care about the blackberries. They just care about having this little strip that's facing your front driveway neatly trimmed, because that's what's most visible to, it has the most aesthetic impact, because people don't see the blackberries. You can have a huge like jungle of blackberries, and people don't, if people don't see it, if it's spilling out into your neighbor's property, they don't really care that much. All they care about is like making everything neatly, uniformly, shaved down, right? And I have to admit that something about this I just really don't like, because, well, for one thing, there's this kind of funny thing about like mowing, like keeping your grass really short, in that if you look at it from a scientific point of view, rather than an aesthetic point of view, let's look at a scientific point of view. From a scientific point of view, your grass is an organism. It's a life form. And the more that you mow your grass really, really short, it actually damages that life form and makes it more difficult for that life form to survive. The grass always has to regrow itself. And this is why people end up with these big, like, patches of missing grass in their lawn, because it's over mowed. And you need to use fertilizer and more water to make the grass grow more. But then as the grass, then you have to, it basically creates this vicious cycle where you're using more resources, more manpower, more gas, more electricity if you have an electric vehicle, more fertilizer, more water. And the more you do each of these things, the more you have to do more. And it just builds up and builds up and builds up. And to the point where in the USA, they have fresh drinking water is approximately 1/3 of the fresh drinking water supply is spent on keeping grasses, the lawn, looking green and nice, right? For the sake of aesthetics. For the sake of a sense of uniformity and conformity with all your neighbors, so you look like you blend in and you are part of the same organization of community as everybody else, right? That is worth. And it's also interesting to note that here in Canada, we had a massive water main break in Montreal. We had a massive water main break in Calgary, where huge amounts of drinking water, fresh water, was lost. And yet, during the midst of that, you have people that just have their sprinklers on, because they don't. And this is the kind of thing of like, I'm thinking about this going into like Venus, Venus and Scorpio, the eclipse in Libra. What's fair? Is it fair to use 1/3 of your nation's water supply to keep your grass green? Right? Also considering that in America, apparently the only places that have a climate that's natural for grass is certain areas on the East Coast, and that there's a large swath of area of North America where grass doesn't even grow naturally. So you have to spend 1/3 of your total fresh water drinking supply to create an aesthetic ideal, which is more or less artificial, that wouldn't be like this if we hadn't developed this idea on our own, right? And then this is not even getting into the fact that it's like, for another thing, it's an ecological dead zone. So from the point of view of the bylaw officer that I'm dealing with, that their main concern with why they want to creep, there's also certain things about there's certain things, what I'm saying is like, when you leave your grass growing a little bit more, it's also more drought resistant, meaning like you don't actually have to water your lawn as much, because when you let grass grow to a fuller length, it actually holds in the water. So you don't have, like, if everybody let their lawns grow over a little bit, they wouldn't have to consume 1/3 of the nation's water supply on this thing that's basically pointless, right? And so the concern basically though is that by having tall grass, you are creating a situation where there may be a risk of rats or rodents or stuff like that, right? Now the thing he didn't. There's a lot of rodents in the area, such as cute little bunny rabbits, squirrels. There are indeed rats. There are also the common field mouse, the vole, and all these animals are part of a natural ecosystem where we have hawks, we have bald eagles, we have owls, we have all sorts of birds of prey which use these animals as a food source, right? Now, as I'm walking my dogs in the morning, one of the things that I notice as I walk my dogs around are rats on the street, which have clearly the victims of rat poison, right? And the reason why you can tell a rat is a victim of rat poison is because there are so many animals that would use this animal as food source, but the animals know better not to eat it. They have developed the prey animals have learned to tell what is a poisoned rat so they don't eat it. So instead of it being food for an animal in a natural cycle, we just have dead rats dead in the middle of the street, and which are, if somebody's dog or cat were to like try to attack, you have a risk of poisoning your pet, like the pets of the neighbors around you, right? By using all this rat, and also the rat poison is also a risk for children. Like, what if a small child finds the stuff that you set out as a rat trap and doesn't know what it is, and then the child gets poisoned, right? These are all sorts of reasons why rat poison isn't very great. Now, there's a reason why I'm getting into this, and there's something about the dealing with my bylaw officer and the emphasis that's put on, like, the main issue is to make sure there aren't rats, because what would be like, and I have to admit that there are times when you see a rat tail that gives you a kind of instinctual heebie-jeebies, right? And there's a scientific rational basis for our aversion to rats, which obviously comes from the bubonic plague, where rats were carriers of disease, right? And so, but the thing is, when you're talking about in the actual, grounded in the reality that we're in, there's a lot of issues with disease, like whether that's COVID, whether that's the monkeypox, or whether that's, polio in Gaza, all this kind of stuff. We have a lot of, grounded in reality reasons for being concerned about disease and disease control. But, rats, it's just an aesthetic thing, right? There's an aesthetic, and this is what I'm talking about with Venus into Scorpio. Venus has to do with what's considered beautiful, what's considered ugly, and Scorpio is obviously the sign of the scorpion, right? The sign that this venomous insect that's considered to be dangerous, right? Now, you could also talk about spiders. You could also talk about ants and stuff like that. Another similar thing which happened is that it's been a while since my mother decided to cancel or fire the exterminators that she was hiring, and part of the reason why she hired exterminators in the first place is that, unfortunately, our house seems to have a reoccurring ant infestation, where the ants come out through the floorboards and stuff like that, and so it's good to have exterminators to keep the ants under control, right? Now, even also it's kind of interesting because ants, there's a practical point of view of why we have a problem with ants, but then there's also an aesthetic point of view where if you look at the paintings of people like Salvador Dali, the ants are used to represent this kind of whether this is sexual trauma or incest or nervous hysteria around like sex or something like that. People can do a better. I'm just giving you a quick rundown, but what I'm trying to express here is that there's a rational scientific understanding of things, and then there is a aesthetic symbolic kind of thing on the other hand, right? And that one of the things about because I was saying my mother decided to cancel the exterminators, right? That there was one of the things that she hired the exterminators to try to keep the ants under control, and instead what they also did a bunch of work that we didn't ask them to do, which was and they're like, we took care of all the spiders for you, right? We cleaned out all the spiders. We used our insecticide to kill. And we didn't have a problem with the spiders, right? And like the spider, we don't. And because this could be my mother's attitude. She has this funny sign that she's had in her house since I was a little kid that says, "Don't worry, spiders. We keep house casually," right? And there's something about, like, again, Halloween time, the aesthetics of spider webs, cobwebs, and what that symbolizes aesthetically. But then from a point of view of like dealing with the actual creatures themselves, there is a certain, honestly, I'm not immune to arachnophobia. I get freaked out if a spider surprises me, or like sometimes when I was talking about doing blackberry bushes, I've been doing the blackberry bushes and there are all these spider webs and spiders mixed up with them, and sometimes you're like, oh my god, there's a spider on me, get it off or whatever, right? Like, you have this instinctual reaction, right? But compared to I spent a whole year living in Australia. In Australia, they have huge fucking spiders that'll kill you, right? We don't have those here. We don't have poisonous spiders. We have snakes here, right? The snakes around here are harmless garter snakes, right? They're not the kind of snakes that are dangerous to you, but there is this aesthetic thing where if you go to the Bible, the snake is associated with the devil tempting Eve with the forbidden fruit and all this kind of stuff, or but from a practical point of view, if you actually keep the spider in your house, the spider as a predatory animal survives by eating other insects. So it's like, if you can deal with having one spider in the corner, that spider, you treat it as a friend, then that spider will help keep the other insects under control, right? But the thing is, it's like dealing with people who are like bylaw officers, dealing with people who are exterminators, and the thing is, like, there could be, I don't know if there's I might as well say it, there could be a racial kind of, like, when you're dealing with people who are immigrants, when you're dealing with people who are, it almost feels like a kind of internalized racism or something like that. Like, we have to, like, we need to make the white people happy, and the white people don't like us because we look different from us. We have the white people, we have a different skin color. We are judged as being like pests or invaders, so we have to make them comfortable by being like, white people, aren't you happy that we killed all the spiders for you? Aren't you happy that we killed all the rats for you? Aren't you happy that you can live in this clean and sterile, just like totally sanitized environment that doesn't have any of these, these things that are associated with the Christian Satan? All the snakes, spiders, creepy crawlies, the different evil insects. We've purified those from you. We've killed them all off, right? So you don't have to worry about that at all. You can just live in your perfectly sterile white person world with your glaring lights everywhere and your Febreze artificial fucking chemical we don't have any bad smells. We don't have any unsightly odors. You don't have any weird, spicy, foreign people food that'll offend you. It's all just, salads and club sandwiches and everything just fucking, purified into some, homogenized, hellscape of, old old white people who don't know what, like, who've never eaten at a Vietnamese restaurant or something like that, or people, you know what I'm trying to say? Like, it's like they're playing into this dynamic by being like, this is the people we have to cater for, so we have to eliminate all these things which are, don't actually have any scientific problem, but are just coded as things which are aesthetically offensive, right? And so I think that there's something to do with Venus and Scorpio in that it sort of feels like it's like in hostile territory. It feels like a fish out of water, and it is trying to like appease the environment by trying to cater to its idea of what the environment wants, right? Now, there's something about this too. I have to admit, I'm somebody who I'm pacing out these videos because I have an underlying, I don't know if you want to talk about it in terms of having a mental health condition, but I thought I would share something about when I first had what was called a psychosis, or labeled as such. For me, it was more related into using, the idea that expanded states of consciousness, if you think about the idea of like a camera aperture, right? Something that opens up to let more light in, or closes and stuff like that. And the kind of like, sometimes it just, regardless of what's happening, that's actually in the situation, that if you push yourself too far into expanded states of consciousness, that itself is kind of traumatizing, just out of the sake of you're not used to taking in so much light, basically, right? But there's a very specific thing that I noticed, in that I was always raised from this point of view of being like valuing nature, valuing the natural world, valuing the connection with nature. And there's this whole, there's something interesting about, like, people often talk about mania, bipolar mania, or spiritual mania as fundamentally having to do with a problem of not being grounded, right? And that I had this interesting experience of being in a state of like heightened awareness and being all like, I think this is probably even before like in the very early days before I had any encounter with the hospital, but it was kind of like being in a state of being like wide open and being all like, I know the solution. Grounding, obviously, right, is like to connect with the earth, right? And it was kind of like, I don't know if it was just like, it had to do with like okay, when you like are gardening and you're like digging the soil, and it's like there's all sorts of funny like weird creepy crawlies like centipedes and worms and all this kind of stuff, and there's something about like, rather than feeling this like intimate connection with the earth as being something that was curing me of my bipolar mania, I was like, oh my god, there's actually a lot of weird bugs in the ground, or there's something about like experience, like the earth is having its own alterity, basically. That the earth is its own, the earth isn't just there as some loving, unconditional Mother Earth, that there's stuff in there that is like, the stuff crawling around in the soil isn't there just to make you comfortable. It's doing its own, it has its own job to do. That it's not just there, like, and then it starts, there's something there of like being wide open, and that triggering these kind of like archaic, unconscious, aesthetic things that is very similar to like, the snake is evil, because it's in the Bible that the snake is evil. Or the worm is some terrible unhuman thing, or that, you know what I'm saying, like all these things that we have, or the rat tail is a sign of pestilence and disease, right? Or that this kind of like the symbolic semiotic regime of signs of like, and it sort of kicks in, and in the same way that like I was never like my grandparents were Christian, but I was never raised Christian by my family. And also in these states of like expanded consciousness, expanded awareness, I started having the sense of like, I don't know, Christians talk about it like the fear of God or something, right? Or the idea of like the Old Testament God, like some angry male God that's just going to like smite you with thunder and lightning. That doesn't have anything to do with anything that I personally would believe in, or something that I would personally subscribe. But it's sort of like, the more you open up, there's things it could just be an illusion, right? I'm not saying it's necessarily real. It could be like the same way that like a rat tail triggers this aesthetic thing of like, oh my god, it's like the instinct about the bubonic plague, that you're expanding into whatever spiritual state, and then there's something about you run into that thing. Oh shit, this is probably why the Old Testament God seems like such an asshole or something, right? There's all this sort of stuff that you run into. That is just like by having this expanded state of consciousness that you may not be expecting to run into, right? If you're just going to be like, I'm having a normal, rational, grounded state of consciousness, and I'm just exploring about this by reading in books or something like that, right? And that I'm just mentioning that because that's one part of just like the landscape of the experience that seems to go with spiritual emergency or psychosis or whatever you want to call it. And yeah, there's this thing about like Scorpio and the fear, and a lot of it had to do with basically like getting over that kind of fear. Although, I mean, it still comes up sometimes. Now, there's something about, speaking of reading books, I have been basically continuing to read books from Byung. I just read this one called What is Power? And I thought this would be worth including in this video because, first of all, the square between Venus and Pluto often being connected to power dynamics. If you also notice that the cover of this book features a lot of water, and the fact that I got a little bit of a stain on here, but they have a grand water trine happening, right? So there's a certain, I mean, I don't know. This is what I'm playing off of, though. The fact that we're going to this grand water trine out of a square with Pluto, and that this book is something that Byung wrote in 2005, but wasn't translated to English until 2019. So it's a little bit like, I don't know. If you read a lot of Byung, it's like you can tell this is kind of like his earlier stuff, and he's kind of gone in a bit of a different direction since then. But do I put my bookmark in the wrong place? Oh my god. Oh no, I got it here. I'm going to read this thing about. I'm not going to explain the whole book or anything, but I'm going to read what Byung this one part, and we'll explain it later, okay? And he's talking about the philosopher George Bataille here. I looked it up. Bataille doesn't have Venus in Scorpio or anything like that, but Bataille does have Saturn conjunct Uranus in Scorpio. And he seemed, I mean, I don't know. I'm not a subscriber to Bataille or anything, but nonetheless, I think this is an interesting thing to incorporate into the video here. George Bataille has a radically different understanding of sacrifice. He does not deny the economic dimension of sacrifice, but according to him, the deeper meaning of the sacrifice lies outside economic calculation. Sacrifice represents an antithesis to utility and economy. It is, at bottom, a particular kind of destruction and consumption. To sacrifice is to give as one gives coal to the furnace. The act of sacrifice returns the sacrificed object to the state of continuity in which there is no limitation, no separation between subject and object, between human being and world. It is an act of de-reification and the removing of limits. The thing is removed from the context of usefulness and purpose. It is thus given back its secret. Bataille's name for the limitless continuity as the proper dimension of religion is intimacy or immanence. Thus his sacrificer declares, I withdraw you, victim, from the world in which you were and could only be reduced to the condition of a thing having a meaning that was foreign to your intimate nature. I call you back to the intimacy of the divine world, of the profound immanence of all that is. The continuum of power is a continuum of self. As opposed to power, religion is tied to the experience of a limitless continuum of being. It is a return to the moment when the human being was one with the universe and differed neither from the stars nor the sun. According to Bataille, the shudder one feels when confronted with the divine is caused by the violence in the removal of limits, a violence which overcomes differences. The sacred is exactly comparable to the flame that destroys the wood by consuming it. It, like an unlimited fire, it is the opposite of a thing. It spreads, it radiates heat and light, it inflames and blinds, and the one inflamed and blinded by it suddenly also is a blinder. The experience of the undivided unity of being, which Bataille frequently invokes, is orgiastic and regressive. Tellingly, his conception of a philosophy of religion sets out from animality. Animals, he says, already live in a continuity of being. They are in the world like water in water. Therefore, they have no need for religion. They already rejoice in the continuum of being. In the undivided unity of being, no power relations can form because power relations presuppose a difference. There's nothing in animal life that introduces the relation of the master to the one he commands. Not even in the consumption of the other is preceded, not even the consumption of the other is preceded by a battle or an appropriating of the other. In the continuum of being, there is simply no separation between self and other. There is no assimilation or appropriation in the strict sense of these terms, for these would follow the formula of the logic of power, i.e. they would be a return to self in the other. The undivided unity of being does not allow for separation between the eater and the eaten. What is given when one animal eats another is always the fellow creature of the one that eats. It is in this sense that I speak of immanence. So basically, this gets into the thing that in the animal world, the eagle or the hawk or the owl eating the field mouse or the rabbit is a undivided thing, right? It's like where they say you are what you eat, right? And if you compare that world of the animal world, of the natural world, also similar to digging, like being a human being, digging in your garden and seeing worms and centipedes and all the things that, from the point of view of nature, the natural world, the earthworm is the dirt, basically. You can't have dirt without the earthworm. You can't have soil without all these things breaking down, decomposing matter into soil, right? And so there's a kind of like, there's something about the idea of, boundary dissolving experience where you're going to be like, I'm going to open up and feel at one with nature, and then there's some pesky limit that reminds you you're a human. You're not some worm crawling around in the dirt, right? That's there to be like, no, I'm not just going to melt into the ground and melt into the natural world. I'm actually a human being, and there's all these things here to remind me that I'm a human being, right? And the sense of human separation from nature is not so easily overcome, right? And it's for this reason that we create a sense of alienation, right? That we're not just out there as hunter-gatherers picking. Like, that's so funny because so many people that I knew in Vancouver Island get really into this. They want to just be like, we're just gonna like pick berries and forage and like forget our human civilization and be there's this kind of like anarcho-primitive kind of mentality that kind of shows up. I saw this also when I was traveling in Europe, that there's certain like European hippies that are very much like wanting to go back to like caveman time and just be like immersed in this sort of like there's no separation between me and nature kind of thing. But the actual experience of being a human being is very it's like this, you know, you go to the grocery store and you don't hunt your meat. It's this packaged as this, like, you know, wrapped in plastic, this weird thing that's very alien from the actual animal that gives you the food, right? Or even when it comes to, I mean, if you grow your own vegetables, you have a more direct connection with the soil and the being able to grow things and all this. But that kind of, you know, like the whole thing is like, we have a whole bunch of like strawberries on our front lawn, rather than having a total sterile, lifeless dead zone, we're going to grow a bunch of strawberries, right? So what happens if some of the strawberries go rotten, right? What happens if an animal starts eating strawberries off your front lawn? Is this all of a sudden, like, rather than having this really, like, neatly controlled thing where the human property is somehow in this separate, it makes us uncomfortable, because you're like, wait a minute, I go to the grocery store to buy my fruit. I don't just have strawberries growing on my front lawn. Are you crazy? You know, you could have a rodent, you know, I mean, okay, sure, squirrels look cute, but, like, what if it's a rat, right? If you got a rat eating a strawberry on your front lawn, you know, that means you fucking got the bubonic plague, you know. But there's all these things it doesn't actually make sense, though, right? There's this, and this is the problem about, basically, the problem of fascism is basically there's all these things that don't, we've got these old software programs running that are kind of like, rats mean the plague, snakes mean the devil, you know, worms are bad, you know, we don't see the worm as something that's making us fertile soil to grow better tasting strawberries. We see the worm as some weird, dirty thing that we need to, like, get all the Lysol and just fucking spray it, you know. And this is like, this is what it feels like. Like, I had this thing with this problem about, like, boundaries with my neighbor, that the neighbor didn't like the weeds, so he just decided to, I'm just gonna pour Roundup over the fence. Ha ha ha! We're just gonna fucking chemical warfare our neighbors, because that's, you know, these people are, you know, like, this is like why I don't fucking like living here around a bunch of, like, stuck up suburbanites with how the most, like, sterile, like, you know, front lawn. You know, I would feel more comfortable if I had a community of people who apparently, like, shared my values in terms of, you know, not using, like I said, what's fair? It's not fair that we have to put on all this work mowing our lawns every fucking day, and we have to spend all this money on fertilizer, and we have to spend 1/3 of our fucking drinking water of America to you know. Meanwhile, the water mains are breaking, right? Like, we got huge fucking floods of water mains in Calgary, Montreal, like, people who can't shower for a fucking month, and we're like, our bylaw officers are like, you're like, why aren't you sprinkling your lawn? Why is your lawn brown? Why don't you have our you know what I mean? Or, like, apparently they had this thing where, like, the people, you know, like, apparently in suburbia in the 1950s, if you didn't mow your lawn, the city would hire a lawn mowing crew to forcibly mow your lawn for you, and then send you the bill. You don't even have a choice of it. Like, you know, it's the city controls your property. The city, and this is what Byung Chul is talking about with power, is that power is basically the ability to recognize the self in the other, right? The power is basically like, oh, you know, I can see that you are just like me because you have the same boring lawn that doesn't have anything growing in it, and we just get these fucking, like, you know, we get our strawberries from California. Yeah, we don't grow strawberries around here because we're not a bunch of fucking hippies, right? We get them shipped up from California. We get our you know, we get our lettuce from Mexico, right? We don't believe in farming. Because we need to have, like, to be human is to be, like, as separate from the actual process of growing food from the natural world as possible, and also to be separate from, you know, people who don't look like you, people, you know. So we have a bunch of people, or, you know, we're not going to go trick-or-treating, we're going to be afraid of our neighbors, we're going to be paranoid, and instead of actually talking to them face to face and saying, hey, like, what's going on with your lawn? We're going to call the bylaw officer on you and threaten you with fines and stuff like that, right? And this is the world we live in, right? And I don't like living in this kind of world. And so fuck you. So this is, again, I don't know. I've been stressed out, and maybe I'm expressing that in this video. But I feel basically surrounded by a bunch of people who I don't see myself in the people around me, and they don't see themselves in the people around me, and they using, you know, stupid things like conforming to a certain standard of what a front lawn is supposed to be like to make me feel like I'm under all this constant pressure to conform to some standard of what's supposed to be normal and decent. So it doesn't actually make any fucking sense at all. And meanwhile, these same people are poisoning rats, which is basically like, you know, you're rather than seeing these things as part of an ecosystem, it's like just all they are is there to offend your aesthetic sensibility, so you can just kill them with rat poison, kill them with insecticides, pesticides, all this kind of stuff. And you know, I don't like it, right? I'd rather live in a place where people weren't like this, right? These aren't the kind of people that I want to invite to my fucking like neighborhood barbecue, all this kind of stuff. Like, I don't know who, the thing is, they don't tell me who they are. I don't know who the fuck they are, right? I don't know if it's this neighbor, that, you know, maybe it's safer just to assume everybody in this fucking town are a bunch of fucking assholes, right? You know, I think that's probably the safest assumption. They're just a bunch of everybody in this town is a bunch of fucking assholes who have their head up their ass, who don't talk to their neighbors, and instead just threaten fucking bylaw enforcement officers. Well, you know, and we also get this whole thing happening in the news where the RCMP, the police, are themselves, you know, they're if somebody has a domestic abuse call, they end up making sexist jokes on their you know, or if they get a call to go around to the native reserve. Well, you know, we're not going to help the natives. Right? You got a bunch of fucking misogynistic, racist, you know, basically fascist cops enforcing these stupid fucking laws that don't make any sense. And then you have a bunch of brown people who basically feel like that's the world they have to fit into. And, you know, it's just like, oh my God. It's fucked, basically. I don't know. Maybe I'm getting too worked up, but it stresses me out, okay? I don't like this. I live in a community where I don't feel like I have any friends. I just have a bunch of fucking like faceless, impersonal neighbors threatening me with fines. And they can go fuck off, okay? All right. Thank you very much for watching. I'm sorry for getting worked up. This is how I feel, okay? Thank you.